I love cooking from scratch, but sometimes there are those days where I just need something quick and easy. And sometimes from scratch food doesn't come very quick and easy, but I've been working on setting my future self up for success and stocking the freezer with whole quality foods made from scratch that are convenient to pull out and use as our family needs. So come spend some time in my farmhouse kitchen with me as I stock my freezer with from scratch delicious convenience foods. When I am thinking about things I can make to stock my freezer, I always am trying to think about how I can do it in a way that really doesn't require any extra work on my part. I mean, maybe a little bit of extra time, but I'm not thinking about doing a big freezer prep day. I've tried to do that in the past and it just does not work out well for me. So I try to stick to things that we use often, that reheat really easily. There's not a lot of extra steps involved, and that I can just make extra of without really having to do much extra. So when it comes to prepping things for breakfast, I try to stick to things that I can just pop in the toaster that are really simple and easy to reheat. And so we do a lot of fresh meal waffles, fresh meal pancakes, and things like that, French toast in the freezer because you can just put them in the freezer and then stick them in the toaster and they come out fresh and delicious without any extra steps. So I am making a double batch of my fresh meal waffles. This recipe is on my blog makingmaplehill.com, but a single batch is just about 3 cups of freshly milled soft white wheat. Actually, this time I was using spelt, so you can use either or 320 grams. I go by the gram measurement. I just weigh out the berries as I'm putting them in the mill, and then I have the exact amount of flour I need. So 320 grams of soft white or spelt wheat, half a teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 2 eggs, 2 cups of milk, a third a cup of melted butter. You could use avocado oil if you don't want to use butter, and then a tablespoon of vanilla. And so I doubled that. So I just doubled all of those measurements, and it made a ton of waffles for us. And then I just break them right up and stick them in the bag. I don't flash freeze them. You definitely could, like if you wanted to take this to someone on a meal train or something like that, I would probably freeze them and then stick them in the bag just so they're pop apart super easily, but they still pop apart just fine. And we will eat these for breakfast for weeks. I usually will try and do like once a week, something like this, waffles, and then maybe the next week some pancakes, and just keep a flow going of where I'm not cooking breakfast every single day, but there's always something available every day for us to pull from, whether it's granola or just options of easy things that with some variety. So we're not sick of eating the same thing every day, but also I'm not having to dirty up the kitchen every single morning to cook breakfast. Another way I like to take advantage of the work I'm already doing in the kitchen is with browning ground beef. That is something that just seems simple to do, but it's also another step for dinner that can be saved by doing a lot of it at once. So I had pulled out 6 pounds of ground beef from the freezer that I had gotten from my sister. They raise some beef, and so I could grab some from her because it was super convenient. She dropped it off at my house for me. And I got to chopping up a bunch of peppers and a bunch of onions because that's pretty much the base for us with any sort of ground beef. There's not a whole lot that I couldn't use ground beef with peppers and onions in. I could use it for tacos, I could use it for pasta, I could use it for a whole bunch of things. So I chopped up a bunch of onions, chopped up a bunch of peppers, and got them sauteing in some butter in my Dutch oven. And once they were sauteed pretty well, I added in all of the ground beef, and it was plenty of space in my pot here. You could do it in a large stock pot, but it worked out really well because I was using 2 pounds of the ground beef for the meal I was making that night, and I was doubling that meal as well. So I was kind of using this in a way to work for me in a lot of different ways. I was using 2 pounds of ground beef for the meal, but the meal was also making an extra freezer meal, and then I was going to have 4 pounds of ground beef left to put away for future meals. So those are the kind of things that I just really like to try and think about ahead, and how can I utilize this thing I'm already doing to my benefit. I mean, it's the same way if like you're making, I think in this video I didn't show myself making the pie crust, but I was making pie crust for chicken pot pie. And then after I made the pie crust in my mixing bowl, just took it out and made bread dough in it because there's nothing in the pie crust that wasn't also in the bread dough. And I was saving myself a step of dirtying up another dish. I was able to just take the pie crust right out, wrap it, put it in the fridge, and then move on to making the bread dough. It's just those little things that can really help take some of the overwhelm and time out of cooking in the kitchen, which if you cook from scratch, you know it's pretty much endless. You are constantly making food, and if you are committed to eating at home a lot, you go through a lot of food. So any ways where we can just find those little hacks to save ourselves a lot of time without having to really sacrifice the way we want to eat has just been a game changer for me. I first kind of learned about this method of cooking from the Summa Domestica books by Layla Lawler. She calls it save a step cooking, and it's basically where you're never making a full meal from scratch. You're always having a component you can pull from. Just like this dinner, I made everything, but then I served it with some rolls that I already had in our freezer. And so it's a full, well-rounded, really delicious meal without having to make every single component every single night. Because if you cook from scratch, you know that it may not sound complex, but making the rolls and making the main dish and making the sides, it can be a lot, and you wind up spending so much of your time in the kitchen, which I love to cook. I love to be in the kitchen, but I also have other responsibilities, and some days I'm just low on energy. I want something easy. And so I really come to lean on this whole save a step style of cooking. So for this dish I am making for this night, it is not on the blog. It is a recipe I kind of found in, I was thumbing through one of my vintage cookbooks, and it was called sour cream beef casserole or something like that. So I was boiling up 2 bags of shells. I love that pasta from Costco. They don't always have that specific shape of pasta. It's got like some bow tie. It comes in like a pack of 6. So whenever they have it, I grab it because I love having those elbow noodles for pasta. And then I am taking out a lot of the ground beef that I was cooking up. So I left, I would guess, about 2 pounds. I didn't weigh it out. And then I added in some seasoning, some Dijon mustard, and then a lot of sour cream. This was definitely not a low fat meal by any means, or low carb with the pasta, but it was very delicious. So I added in the sour cream, and then it also called for cream cheese. So I added that in, and then it called for tomato sauce. So basically, like a creamy spaghetti pasta, but it was very good. And we mixed it up with the noodles and then topped it with some cheese and just baked it up. But then I made enough so that I was able to freeze some in a metal baking dish or aluminum baking dish, which I know is not the healthiest option. And I could have frozen it in glass. But my thought also with doing all of this was that I would also like to have some things in the freezer that I can pull out for a hospitality meal or a meal train or something like that. I always try to volunteer to bring meals to people, but it is just an extra task to do. So being able to more readily volunteer myself, knowing I have already like pre-done meals that I could just either take to them completely frozen for their own convenience or pull out myself and bake without having to shift around the schedule because sometimes things like that are last minute. You find out about a need, you want to help, but you already have a full plate. So that was also a motivation of mine for this is just being prepared for myself, for my family, but also being prepared to serve. We have a church family that I love and I love to offer to help when I can. And it just feels really good to be prepared to serve my family or serve others. So while we ate dinner and cleaned up and all, I just allowed the ground beef to kind of come down to room temperature, and then I scooped some out to store in the fridge for a meal later this week. And then I filled up two just quart size freezer Ziploc bags with the rest of the ground beef and pepper onion mixture. And this will just be so easy. I mean, you could use it for chili, you could use it for tacos, you could use it for just about anything that calls for ground beef. And again, it's not anything monumental. Ground beef is fairly easy to cook up, but it's just one of those things where it's already done. You really don't even have to stress about pulling it out ahead of time because you could just thaw it really quickly in a skillet and have dinner done. I have been working on a fresh milled, 100% fresh milled sourdough sandwich bread recipe. Or sorry, yes, 100% fresh milled sourdough sandwich bread recipe. And I really got it this time. And I was planning to make two loaves and put one in the freezer, but we actually wound up getting sick. I'll talk more about that later in the video with what I'm making with one of the things. So we ate both of the loaves of bread within a few days because it was just a very easy thing we could all have, and it was giving us nourishment. But bread is another thing that freezes oh so well, and this recipe will definitely be coming to the blog soon. It is really delicious and nutritious with the fresh milk grains, and we all really enjoyed it. So the next meal I was working on doubling up with a full meal ready in the freezer was chicken pot pie. I love chicken pot pie. It is so delicious, especially when I take the time to use all fresh ingredients like chop the potatoes, chop the carrots. These were green beans from our garden. Sometimes I like to cheat and just use the frozen mixed vegetables. Costco sells a big bag of organic frozen mixed vegetables. So I always keep that on hand. Well, not always. I like to keep that on hand as a backup because it is great to have just to throw in things. But if I can use like fresh broth and those fresh vegetables, it is just so good. But it is a labor of love because with all the chopping and making the chicken and making the pie crusts and all of that, it is definitely a meal that takes some time. And so I thought if I was already making it, I could just double up and save myself a full meal's worth of work one day down the road because chicken pot pies freeze super well. So I chopped up some onion, potato, carrots, green beans, and then I put in some broth and covered it up just to let the vegetables steam really well because one of my biggest pet peeves with homemade chicken pot pie is if I don't cut the vegetables small enough that they cook all the way through in the oven when the pot pie is baking. So I cooked those vegetables for a while in the broth and then I added in some flour to thicken it and some more broth to make the cream sauce. And then that morning I had gotten a whole chicken going in my crock pot. Now I do have this on the blog, my blog makingmaplehill.com. It's just whole chicken, crock pot whole chicken, and you just chuck a whole chicken in the crock pot. I coat it with, oil and seasonings. I make like a rub. This is all in the blog post directions, but I just rub it down with the oil and seasoning rub, and then I put it in the crock pot on high for like 5 hours. And it comes, I mean, you saw, I couldn't even get the whole chicken out. It just completely falls apart in the crock pot. So I did use the whole chicken for this chicken pot pie, but it is making two whole chicken, like two pot pies. So I just chopped up all the meat really well, tossed it in my cream mixture. I had put some milk in there to thicken, like to add the cream to the thickened broth. And then I added in a bunch of seasonings, just like salt, pepper, onion powder, a little bit of paprika, some oregano, and then also added in some frozen corn. I really like corn in my chicken pot pie. And then I didn't want this to cook too long because you really should add like cooled filling to your pot pie. So I removed it from the heat a while before I needed it. And then while I was waiting on that, I took care of my bread dough. It had risen so beautifully. And like I said, this recipe is not on the blog yet, but it will be. I'll just tell you what I did. I did 500 grams of water, 150 grams of starter, 120 grams of avocado oil, 20 grams of salt, and then for my wheat berries, I did 250 grams of soft white wheat. I do this for my artisan bread recipe as well. I like to add a little soft white wheat in there. I don't feel like that's common for fresh mill bakers, but I add soft white wheat to my bread recipes. I don't do all hard wheat. So the 250 grams of soft white wheat and then 750 grams of hard red wheat, and it turned out so well. It was just the perfect sandwich loaf, like super soft, melt in your mouth sandwich bread, which we have been missing because I don't really make sandwich bread with white flour much anymore. I could, but I don't buy a lot of white flour because I am a drop coordinator with Azure Standard, and so I use my little bit of credit I get to stock us on things that really make an impact in our grocery budget. So that includes wheat berries. I always use my credit to stock up on wheat berries. And then now I'm just going back to my chicken pot pie. I rolled out pie crust. I need to work on a whole wheat pie crust recipe. This is just a regular flour recipe. That is one thing that I do really like. I like fresh milled pie crusts, but I have a hard time with them not falling apart as easily. It could just be, my technique with adding in the filling when it's too hot still, but I will be working on a fresh milled recipe. Things like scones and biscuits and pie crust I do really enjoy with regular flour, but I want to work on perfecting them with fresh milled flour as well. And then I was just having some fun with this pot pie we were going to be having tonight. I have these little fall cookie cutter things, and so I have a maple leaf one, and we call our home Maple Hill, and so I use the maple leaf cut out to make a little Maple Hill pot pie. So that was just for fun. But the second one, I went ahead and got assembled while the other one was in the oven. Like I said, these are a labor of love. Like, this is not really a quick and easy dinner, but to be able to make two, it will mean we get to enjoy a really delicious dinner that is quick and easy in a few weeks when I decide to use this pot pie. So a few days later, we were sick. It started off with my husband, and then it migrated to my daughter and I. Thankfully, our boys were good, but I did not want to cook anything, but we needed some dinner, and so I used that ground beef that I had prepped earlier in the week to my advantage. I dumped it in the crock pot, which I had had some broth going in. So after I cooked that whole chicken the day before, I put the bones right back in the crock pot and turned it on high and just let it go. I have a bone broth recipe on my blog, but it's really simple. You just put the bones, some water. I do a little bit of apple cider vinegar and salt, and then cover it and put it on high forever in the crock pot. And then I strained off that broth and used it to make like a beef barley vegetable soup. It was really good. It served us well, and then I froze the rest. So I made that ground beef work for me even further with freezing the soup. And that's just another way to get a quick convenience meal in the freezer. It's not enough to feed our whole family, but it was enough to save for myself or someone else's lunch. Every little bit counts. Now, a few days later, when I was feeling pretty back to normal, it was a weekend and I was getting breakfast going for my husband. While I was getting breakfast going, I addressed all these bananas I had. I buy a lot of bananas at once, and then once they start turning, I just freeze them. We use them for smoothies, but they're great to have in the freezer for if you want to make banana bread last minute and you don't have any ripe bananas. So I just took care of those, stashed them away in the freezer, and then started working on breakfast for us that Saturday morning. I cracked a whole bunch of eggs and I was making some hash browns. I usually get up and make my husband breakfast in the mornings. He leaves around 5:50 or so, so usually I'm up at like 5:30 to get him out the door and make his breakfast fresh, but there are some days where I don't typically oversleep when he leaves, but it is very common for our youngest to wake up right as I am turning on the stove to make him some breakfast. And so that actually happened the morning I am recording this video. This morning I got up with him. I was going to make his breakfast, turn the stove on, and our youngest started crying, and we just moved him to a room with his brother, did a whole switcheroo. And so I had to cut the stove off and run upstairs with him. And so my husband went out the door before I could come back down. And I just assumed he would grab like McDonald's or something on the way. That's usually what he does if I am unavailable for making his breakfast, but I asked him when he got home because I noticed two of the burritos were missing out of the freezer, and he said he grabbed two burritos and on his way out the door because he has a microwave at work, so they were frozen solid, but it was easy enough for him to just unwrap them. I wrapped them in a paper towel and then I wrap them up in aluminum foil and so he just grabbed those and was able to heat them up in the paper towel at work. I didn't have a ton left over to make, an insane amount of breakfast freezer prep, but my idea is I'm already here. What can I make with what I have that will just save me a little bit of time? So I had six burritos to put in the freezer, and he was able to grab two out and take them to work. It gives me 3 days of breakfast where if for some reason we are off our normal routine, then we have something as backup. And that's kind of the reason why I do this kind of cooking. It's not to do a whole bunch of prep so that I'm out of the kitchen. Because honestly, I've done those kinds of preps before where I have made him a month worth of breakfast with like homemade bagels and all this stuff. I wind up so worn out, and then I get out of the habit of cooking for him in the morning. And so when the time comes when I've run out, I don't want to do the big freezer prep because it's fresh enough in my brain that I remember how much work it was. But I'm also out of the routine of cooking. So the way I like to do freezer prep food is just like one little thing here and there, not this big, massive prep where you're stuck with all these recipes where either you didn't enjoy them or it's some variety. If I do it this way, where I'm doing a little bit at a time, it gives me variety. It gives me options to choose from where it doesn't feel like we are eating a bunch of batch cooked freezer meals, if that makes sense. Now, one thing I do like to do to prep for the freezer is right after I go grocery shopping, when I have fresh meat in the fridge, I like to figure out things I can do with that fresh meat that I wouldn't really be able to do conveniently with frozen until it thaws out. Like ground beef, you can chuck that in the pot and cook it up, but anything like this where I'm making some meatloaf and meatballs, you really have to do that with thawed out meat, and so it's kind of tricky to do ahead of time. And so I like to do some things while I have the fresh meat. And so I took 3 pounds of ground turkey and a pound of ground beef and mixed them all together with, I had some sourdough breadcrumbs on my shelf. I soaked them in milk because I found, especially with just how coarse my breadcrumbs are, you can kind of, they leave like hard chunks in the meat. And so I mixed all that up, just like you would with meatloaf style, eggs, seasonings, milk, breadcrumbs, and got that and just tucked it away in the fridge. And then another big cut of meat I had purchased when I went grocery shopping was this big pork loin from Costco. It's $1.99 a pound when you purchase the pork loin, and then I just cut my own chops. But someone did message me on Instagram when I did a little grocery haul in my stories that apparently you can take this pork loin to the butcher after you pick it out, and they will cut it for you and then put the same price sticker back on, which I just was mind blown by. Not that this was difficult, I was just chatting with my husband and standing here cutting my chops. And it's nice because you can cut them as thick as you want, but apparently they will also cut them to whatever thickness you'd like. So if you shop at Costco, that might be something worth checking out and asking about at the butcher area. But I just got them all cut up. I saved some away for a meal I was planning to make because I did need to get these frozen. The pork loin had been in the fridge for a few days. And then I marinated some. So I did like a just lemon, coconut aminos type of marinade. And then I did another one that was honey and some lemon and coconut aminos and some broth and ginger. So just slightly different. And again, this is not a super like big freezer prep situation, but it's just something to where when I pull these pork chops out of the freezer and stick them in my fridge to start thawing, they're going to be marinating the whole time. It's not something I have to think about once they are thawed to make sure to marinate them. And I can use them for anything. I could cook them up and make pork fried rice. We could do, just some slow cooker pork chops. just having options and variety already in the freezer, ready to go. I did freeze just another plain bag. I have a recipe I really want to try. Um, I found in one of my cookbooks that autumn pork chops with apples, and I the night I saved some fresh in the fridge, I was making a creamy baked pork chops. I've done it before, but it's so easy. It's just cream soup with your pork chops. I do sear them in the pan first, and then adding in chopped onions and mushrooms, and you coat it with cream of soup, which I make homemade cream soup. I have that recipe on my blog, makingmaplehill.com. You can just search cream soup, homemade cream soup, it'll come up. But it is also extremely easy to batch prep. So it's another one of those things that takes me no extra effort to make quadruple, which is what I did with this. I did 4 times the recipe because I knew I wanted to probably do 2 times the recipe for the pork chop dinner. And then I plan to freeze these. And this is kind of a test I want to test out to see how this recipe does freezing so I can add that information to my blog post. But with cream soup, you just do butter and flour. I used fresh milk flour because I was out of white flour. You make a roux in the pan. I do some salt and garlic powder and pepper, and then you add some broth to thicken it, or to make that to thicken the broth with the roux, and then you add in some milk, and it makes just like you would expect to find at the stores, cream soup, but it is so delicious, especially if you use homemade broth. It just takes the flavor to a whole nother level. And then I have these silicone molds. I can link these in the description of the video, but they are super handy. I have frozen all sorts of things in here. Broth though, and things like this are my favorite to freeze because you'll see in a little bit, I will just pop them right out after they're frozen, but I just stuck them away in the freezer. And then I have my jar of cream soup ready to go in the fridge the next day when I was making that pork chop dinner. And now I am just coming back to take care of that meatloaf mixture I had made. I just let it set in the fridge for a day because our dinner plans changed. I was going to be using part of it for dinner, but I just left it in the fridge. The next day I came and I formed half of it into meatballs. And then the other half I put in the pan to make a meatloaf. And it's funny because the night before I'm recording this video, last minute, my dad had asked if I wanted to bring the kids over to swim in the little pool they have. So I knew I wouldn't want to cook dinner when we got back. So I chucked the meatballs straight from frozen into the crock pot with some teriyaki sauce from Aldi, and it was delicious. And that is the whole point of the reason I cook like this is because it's not to do some massive prep where I don't have to cook. It's just to give myself options when something comes up or a certain thing doesn't work out for dinner. I'm not scrambling or ordering takeout because really on our budget, we just really try not to eat out unless it's a special occasion or some weird circumstance. We try to save our money by cooking at home. And when I am cooking all the time, I like to give myself some breaks. So I hope this helped you see ways you could also prep some things ahead of time for yourself, even if you are a busy mama. I know it's hard to find the time, but simple ways to double up what you're already doing really make a huge difference. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe. I make a new video every week about life in our 1800s farmhouse, cooking from scratch, and making a cozy home. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.